Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, it's time for another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. I'm Michael James here in Chicago, bringing it to you. This one is going to be number 145 since the very beginning of the pandemic. It's for the week of March 25th, and just for your information, we are recording it on Wednesday, March 22nd. No longer live at the Heartland, but sometime we'll be live back in the studio, maybe. Right now, we got the Zoom going. We can go all over the world. Today, we're staying in Chicago. We've got two wonderful guests coming up. Kathy Kelly, longtime peace activist, is going to talk to us about young women and refugees in Afghanistan. And then an election lawyer who's really active in elections and making sure things go on the straight and narrow will be Ed Mullen. I'm looking forward to talking to both of them. On the good news front, I'm going to pump up my son, Hal James. He's been busy making a movie. If you go by my house, you'll see some exterior stuff going on, and that's because they created something inside, which we'll tell you about later. But he has come on board as the engineer of the show, helps me a whole lot. We've been doing this show for many, many years, both myself, Katie Hogan, Tom Clark, before that, even others. We used to have fundraisers, and lots of musicians who came on the show would do a little pitch and sing a song or two, and we had a good time. We got to do it differently now. We need a little bucks. We got to pay this engineer. So get a hold of me at fatback@aol.com, and we will be greatly appreciative. Okay, that's it for the good. What's good happening, and that's the inauguration of our fundraising drive, I would say. We're actually going to be sending out letters. Let's call your attention to Election Day, both here in Chicago and up in Wisconsin. Election Day is Tuesday, April 4th. And Ed Mullen will be filling us in on Chicago's mayoral race and the aldermanic races that are underway. I would suggest that if you are supportive of any candidate, particularly I would say Brandon Johnson, there's lots to do to help to get out the word, to clarify a lot of the lies that are coming out from the other candidate. And everyone, whether it's an aldermanic runoff or the race for mayor, can use your action and your support and your help. So make a point of finding out who's running and what you can do to get them elected. On the labor front, this week, we still have a lot of action going on in Europe. There's stuff happening all across the country, and most notable is here in the States, in Los Angeles. There is a strike underway. They've been out, it's 2 days now on Wednesday, the 22nd. They'll be out for another day. It's the support workers, it's the kitchen workers, the bus drivers, the janitors, you know, the people who make it all work, in addition to the wonderful teachers. In this case, the teachers are out on strike too in support, or out in support. So 420,000 kids aren't going to school in Los Angeles, but hopefully their parents and others are talking to them about the reasons why. One of the things we like to keep everyone who listens or watches abreast of is police community relations. And here in Chicago, we have these new police district councils, which are going to make a difference in how police are trained and behave. But I'm going to call your attention to a press release that came out today. Network 49 and community representatives from Chicago's Use of Force Working Group have released a report on the findings of the Chicago Police Department training program. And I'll just read you a couple lines that were prepared for me by Michael Harrington, who is the chairperson, along with our co-host Katie Hogan of Network 49. And he says, Chicago's multi-million-dollar police training program teaches officers to fear Chicago residents as potential threats, fails to minimize police violence, and also teaches them how to justify or cover it up, according to a new report. The 31 community members who served on the City of Chicago's Use of Force Community Working Group today released their findings on Chicago Police Department training on de-escalation and use of force reporting that the, quote, most glaring absence, end quote, in the one-day, in the viewpoint of the community, is that everything is taught from the perspective of law enforcement. The Chicago Police training teaches officers that their lives matter more than community lives. There's a lot more to it. If you really want to get a copy of that report, you can email me also at fatback@AOL, and I'll make sure you get a copy of it. On the climate front, not too good. We heard on Tuesday a report from the United Nations, I believe it was the United Nations, that we've got about 10 years left to turn things around, or we've reached the point of no return. And if you live on the East Coast or the West Coast or anywhere else there's water, that would mean you would be flooded out and it would not be restored like when the ice melts or something like that. So let's heighten our attention to climate. Let's heighten our attention to the environment. And, we can make a difference. If we want to do it, we can do it. So I'm rooting for us to do it. Okay, let's talk about filibusters. And in this case, it's not in Congress or in the Senate, but we're talking Nebraska. Now, I want all the Cub fans to know who the governor of Nebraska is. He is the brother of the owner of the Cubs, and he is not a very progressive kind of guy. And Nebraska really isn't that progressive of a state anymore, but they do have a bicameral legislature. They only a Senate. They don't have a House. I actually have a relative. His name was Wells, who was a legislator there in the late 1800s. And also, I think he's purported to have been a horse thief. Never came back from Buffalo with the money or the horses when he took them east to market. But in this case, many years later, we're talking about the Nebraska lawmaker who has vowed to burn this session to the ground over anti-trans proposal. While filibustering is not rare for Nebraska's unicameral legislature, Democratic State Senator Makela Kavanaugh is the first lawmaker to filibuster every bill introduced to the floor. This bill, this is I think a quote from her, legislates hate and targets trans youth, she told the Washington Post. Legislating hate is not our job. Our job is to protect our children from the harm this bill could cause them. And then again, quote, I will burn this session to the ground over this bill, she told the body last month. Quote, I have nothing but time and I'm going to use all of it. Also on the LGBT front, bad news from Africa, this time from Uganda. And the report from Al Jazeera that I read today, the 22nd, is that Uganda's parliament has passed sweeping anti-gay legislation that proposes tough new penalties for not only same-sex relationships, it also criminalizes anyone identifying as LGBTQ. While more than 30 African countries, including Uganda, they already have banned same-sex relationship laws. The new law passed on Tuesday appears to be the first to outlaw merely identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. This is according to Human Rights Watch, and it was reported in Al Jazeera. On the sports front and on the in memoriam front, the great high jumper Dick Fosbury has died at 76, I believe, from cancer. He is a guy who was a high school athlete in Oregon, did a different way of doing the high jump. And if everyone thought he was nuts, he was going to hurt himself, now it's the only way that it's done. He was a pretty nice guy. He was a friend of our friend in Athletes United for Peace, Phil Shinnick, who has written some stuff. He wrote to the New York Times. We'll see if it's printed, about his memories of Dick Fosbury. And also in sports, Willis Reed of the New York Knicks has passed away, and he was quite a ball player. Moving beyond in memoriam, last week we had, just so people who might have missed it can know, we had Lenny Mana Hoppingworth, who is running for alderwoman. She's in the runoff for the aldermanic position of alderman of the 48th Ward. And she's a pretty interesting woman, and we had a fun interview. Also, last week, we had Amisha Patel, and Amisha was really good. She is a longtime community organizer, and she is working on the Brendan Johnson campaign, and she filled us in with a lot of details and ideas. So I would recommend that if you missed the two people, Mana Hoppingworth, that would be Lenny Mana Hoppingworth or Amisha Patel, that you go to youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos, and you will find it. There's a lot there to watch if you're ever bored. On the announcement front, here in our own neighborhood, actually in Evanston, is Theo Ubuke's production of Three Penny Opera. It has been Jeff recommended, received a lot of stars from the Chicago Tribune, and it is playing through April the 30th. Some of you will remember they used to be in the No Exit Cafe. I was the executive producer of that back then. Since the Heartland and the No Exit are no longer, Theo Ubuke moved up on Howard Street there in Evanston, but it's real close to the 49th. And it's a wonderful musical theater, so you may want to go check it out. All right, I think that'll be it for our banter. And we're going to come right back. Once again, we have two really wonderful guests, Kathy Kelly, a longtime American peace activist, and she's going to talk to us about a number of things. And then we're going to hook up with Ed Mullen, and he is an election lawyer who works to make sure everything goes smoothly in elections. Going to give us a little bit of overview on what he thinks is happening leading up to the elections here on April 4th in Chicago. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland.
Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back. We're back with more Live from the Heartland, and it really gives me great pleasure to bring on someone who we've had on the show a number of times, but not for a while. Our very favorite American peace activist, Kathy Kelly. Good morning to afternoon to you, Kathy.
Hello, Mike. Thank you for having me on the show.
And congratulations on having gotten married. I didn't know that until you told me just before we got on. And now that you're living in the suburbs, that's one less vote that we can try to conjure up for the election. But that's okay. There'll be plenty of opportunities out there for you. Why don't you tell people a little bit about where you were at 20 years ago, this week, and almost to the day, and what was going on?
Well, I was in a small family-owned hotel called Burj Al Fanar on Sharia Abu Nawas in Baghdad. And we knew that something shocking and awful was coming. But I have to say, when the United States aerial bombardment started to use just about every weapon they had in their arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, it was shocking and it was awful. And this family-owned hotel owner had invited his neighbors and all of the staff and their families to fill up the hotel. So it was maybe 5 stories and it was crowded, but there were grandparents and there were toddlers, and even a newborn was born into the community under shock and awe during the bombardment. And, you know, I for some reason, it's funny what you remember, but little Dina, she was just as cute as a button and precocious and, you know, going where she wasn't supposed to go. But then you would see her stand and look up at her father with a look of apology, and her father would be so angry. And he wasn't angry with her, he was angry with the bombing because that little girl had lost control of her bladder and was standing in a pool of her own urine. And you know, when you saw how the little toddlers tried to cope with all of these like earth-shattering blasts, it was like earthquake after earthquake. And you know, they'd play games like pretending that they were killed, and then they'd come back to life in your arms and laugh. And that's how little kids cope. You know, they make up things to make it seem as though the worst happens and then something good happens. Little Milada used to use flashlights and pretend they were guns and aim them at her sister and her mother and me. And her mother would be so upset, and, you know, I'd be trying to get her to do shadow shows or something else. But I think that was, you know, she would play that game because then she could pretend everybody's still okay. And that's what every parent wanted for their children. They wanted everyone to still be okay. But I don't really have any kind of EMT or first aid skills, but because I'd been in Baghdad longer than others, I'd been going back and forth 27 different trips. The authorities under Saddam Hussein said that if somebody went to the hospital as a doctor or a nurse, they had to have me with them because they knew me. And anyway, I was in the hospital quite a bit during the shock and awe bombing. And again, you can't see a child's body ripped apart and somehow say that child was responsible for Saddam Hussein or deserved to be targeted.
Yeah, I was remembering that when I knew you had been there on this day 20 years ago, I remember that our old friend John Ross, who had visited the Heartland and stayed here with us a little bit before he passed away, but he was there too, and I remember him describing it. Let me ask you, Kathy Kelly, to share with our listeners a little bit about some of the groups that you've been involved with. Voices in the Wilderness, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and I think most recently, the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal.
Thank you. Well, when we gave ourselves the name Voices in the Wilderness, we did it with some trepidation. Like, it was just such a strange name. And we wanted to name ourselves as a group of people who would openly, publicly, deliberately violate the economic sanctions against Iraq. And that was the right thing to do. The government threatened us with 12 years in prison, a $1 million fine, and a $250,000 administrative penalty. And we wrote back and we said, thank you for the clarity of your warning. We understood these penalties in the first place. We find that we can't be governed by unjust laws that kill children, and we invite you to join us. And so, well, they didn't take us up on the invitation. But when we told our Iraqi friends that our name was Voices in the Wilderness, and we asked, how does that translate into Arabic? They kind of laughed and they said, well, actually, it's a very famous phrase from a poem about a voice that ricochets off the mountains in an echo. It's like a shepherd's yodel, and no one will ever hear it. And I said, oh, well, should we change our name? And they said, no, madame, this is exactly what you are. So that was humbling. So that was our name, and we tried to be, what would I say, a means of education, a means of broadcasting the reality of those economic sanctions. Because, one friend of mine, he was from England, and he looked at the pediatrics ward, and he just murmured, I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants. And those economic sanctions, they were sandwiched between the first war in 1991, Desert Storm, and the shock and awe, and they went on and on and on. Those economic sanctions just wrecking the healthcare, the education, all of the things that a society needs so that it would be able one day to overthrow a wrongful, terrible government. I mean, the sanctions guaranteed that Iraqis wouldn't have the strength or the international connectedness or the civil society to be able to oust Saddam Hussein. The sanctions were a wicked imposition. So then we did close the Voices in the Wilderness. We were found guilty, and we said, well, okay, we're not going to pay any fine. And they didn't come and even try to collect. But we opened a new group called Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And with that grouping, we started to expand a bit and go to Gaza and to Lebanon and to Afghanistan. I was unable to enter Iraq. I've been banned from entering Iraq, I'm sorry to say, but after 4 of our friends were held hostage and one of them was killed, the Iraqis said, that's it, we can't protect you from being taken hostage. And so I think in a way it was for our benefit, but they were very clear, no more visas. And then Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan was almost even more unnoticed than the ongoing warfare in Iraq. So we did get to know a wonderful group of quite young teens. They were 11 and 12 when I first met them. And they were idealistic to the max. They wanted to be involved in cleanup of polluted rivers and in overcoming ethnic differences and outreach to widows and orphans. And they really, as they grew older, they just matured more and more into those values. They were a wonderful group to meet. But just precisely those values and the fact that they welcomed Westerners then jeopardized their lives when the Taliban took over, because the Taliban do not have any time for welcoming Westerners. And they were quite suspect of young people organizing in the ways that these young ones did, because they wanted to overcome gender differences and gender inequalities. They were even like very secretly getting bicycles to the girls so the girls can go bicycle riding early on a Saturday morning. And so they were a good group of people. We've managed to help 25 of them resettle in Portugal. And 4 are in Germany, a family of 5 in Brazil, and 6 others in Canada. The United States, boy, if you weren't working for the U.S. Army or USAID, it's almost impossible to bring somebody into this country. So we told our young friends, write the U.S. off of your list. But there are right now 18 in Islamabad, Pakistan. And that's a precarious situation too. Yeah, so we're trying very hard to get them elsewhere.
And you got some of these young people from Afghanistan have gone to Canada as well?
There's a family of 4 in Canada, and then 2 individuals were able to get there. One is in Saskatoon and the other is in Toronto.
Kathy Kelly, let me ask you about both Afghanistan and Iraq and the U.S. policy, and where are we at on both of them? I know you've long talked about double standards in U.S. policy. We know that our military was in both those countries. We played major roles, and we haven't had great outcomes for either country. Give us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, you can't be a pacifist between wars any more than you can be a vegetarian between meals, right? So I'm not going to say, oh yeah, well, in the case of Ukraine, that war is just and that war is necessary. I think wars are always a failure the moment they start. But when you think about Vladimir Putin's wrongful, unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine and the means that he used and the destruction to infrastructure and the endangerment of human lives, what's the difference between that and what the United States did in Iraq and in much of Afghanistan? And then I think, okay, it's wrong to say you can annex 4 parts of Ukraine and say, well, now this is part of Russia. But how hypocritical is it to throw money at the government of Israel when Israel is constantly taking over Palestinian land and persecuting shepherds and farmers and people growing olive trees? And Israel has 200 to 400 thermonuclear weapons. And, the United States has a complete and total double standard. I mean, we supposedly went to war against Iraq thinking Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a totally fraudulent claim. But meanwhile, we would protect Israel, as it said to the world, we won't be the first ones to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, when in fact, certainly Israel has had and does maintain an arsenal of at least 200, possibly 400 thermonuclear weapons. So those kinds of double standards lower the trust of other peoples all around the world toward us. We can't say, oh, we want to be the beacons of democracy. We want to be the people who broker peace negotiations and then turn around and say to the premier of China, forget it. We don't like your peace plan because it's not our peace plan. And so I think we have to stop perceiving ourselves as the number one hegemon. And I actually think as human beings, we have to really change our perspective on all of being and not necessarily think that the human beings have a bigger right to resources and planetary existence, because we actually jeopardize planetary existence to the point where there might become ecological collapse. So how do we defend beings from ecological collapse and pandemics and nuclear weapons? Well, I think it's not going to be through throwing all of our money at the Pentagon. The Pentagon doesn't defend us, it endangers us. I think we have to start to collaborate with other countries in very serious ways, seek to pool needed knowledge to overcome pandemics and to deal with ecological collapse, and certainly to prohibit all nuclear weapons.
Well, I like that. That would be great. And I know that you're going to keep working at it. And we'll see what kind of progress we make. I'm wondering if, well, how do we hold the contractors, the government responsible for the weapons that they produce, that they sell? How would we give us some ideas for some action here?
Well, you have to start somewhere, right? And so I'm part of a group now that's certainly wanting to hold all governments accountable, but how about focusing in on the ones that are making so much profit that they practically can own governments? And I'm thinking about Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Atomics. And so we're going to have a tribunal in November. We welcome
you're hearing it here first.
Well, and it's going to be putting the merchants of death on trial before a people's tribunal. And I really want to welcome anybody to climb aboard on the preparation for this. It's a lot of work because we need to, particularly with regard to wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, Somalia, and Yemen, we need to identify what we believe could potentially be called war crimes. And then how are these major corporations aiding and abetting crimes against humanity, war crimes? And which weapons were used, and did the companies manufacture those weapons knowing what the consequence of the use of the weapons might be? So we're putting those 4 companies that I mentioned on trial, and we would certainly welcome any participation from any of the listeners to Heartland Radio.
And TV, we're on CAN TV too. And we're you can watch us at youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos. So that's why we had you and me both combing our hair before we started. Kathy Kelly, let me ask a little bit more about the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. You say it's going to be November in 2023. Do you have a date and a place yet?
Well, we want to start on November 10th. And it'll all be online, and there will be episodes successively following November 10th. We'll have a panel of judges that right now includes retired Colonel Ann Wright, Salih Al-Ghazali, who is from Iraq and is just graduated from law school last year, Marjorie Cohn, an international law scholar, Jamu Baraka, who also has international renown. And anyway, so we will have these jurists listening to the evidence that's being presented online. We're going to take the 11th off because that's Armistice Day. We want everybody to be out protesting all wars on Armistice Day.
Right on.
And then we'll resume again on the 12th. And we'll hopefully have all around the world watch parties assembled. And we imagine that by January, the tribunal recommendations will have been issued. The panel of jurists will write their recommendations, and then we have to get to work rolling up our sleeves to enforce them.
Hey, Kathy, what is a website or an email address, some way that people can contact you if they want to get involved?
Just spell out merchantsofdeath.org. And that's the website.
Merchantsofdeath.org. Okay, that's a good one. I got two more questions for you. And one of them would be to talk a little bit about Yemen. You know, we know that there's a crisis in Yemen. You have to really dig deep in the news to know what's going on. How about filling us in? And then I got one more question after that.
Well, thank you. You know, people in Yemen, again, people who meant us no harm, are at tremendous risk, not only of U.S. attacks, which have happened whenever the U.S. claims that there's a possible terrorist present, but also the United States has given Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia so many forms of weaponry, so much training, so much cover at the United Nations. And Saudi Arabia has bludgeoned the Yemeni people, attacked infrastructure, caused cholera because of attacking wells that were being dug, attacked hospitals and schools. And yes, the Yemeni Houthi fighters have fought back, and it's actually brought things to something like a stalemate, and there seems to be some possible progress in extending ceasefires. But the siege, the kind of surrounding of the waters and the closure of airports, that is still going on. Saudi Arabia has imposed a state of siege on Yemen since 2015, and this has gone on and on, even though President Biden claimed he was going to put an end to support. That's not what happened.
So what is the status of the Houthis? What are they, religious? Are they leftists? What is their? Can you describe them at all?
I think you could say that they were a tribe of people who became quite strong and would not subordinate themselves to people who had been kind of looting the country for a long time. So they now are a force to contend with, and I don't approve of anybody's militarism or anybody's imprisonment or anybody's torture. I wouldn't say that, you know, this is the good guys, bad guys kind of thing, but I would say that the United Nations should be entrusted with all manner of support to save people from starvation in Yemen right now.
Let me ask you, as we close out this segment on Live from the Heartland, what was your pathway to becoming a peace activist, a pacifist, the person that you've become?
You know, I was really lucky. I finally found my way to a soup kitchen in Uptown. That's what I recommend. Yeah. If you want to get involved and better understand world affairs, find the people who roll up their sleeves and chop the onions and make the vegetables into a soup and offer hospitality to people who might otherwise have no place to stay. You know, go to a kind of a rundown neighborhood and don't be afraid.
Right on.
Courage is the ability to control your fears.
Well, that's good. And I think that's a nice way to start on your path. But do you have any parting words that you've already kind of inspired us? Do you have a few more things you want to say as we close out?
Well, I think community is very, very important. And I actually want to thank Heartland Radio because for many generations, you've fostered community and you've held on to those values. And I think we should make the most impoverished people in the world our number one priority. And in a way, we do that when we try to live more simply and share resources more radically. So I'm in favor of that too.
Well, Kathy Kelly, you're always an inspiration, and I wish I got to see you more often, but I know on some dental appointment, you'll be wandering around and we'll bump into each other.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a musical break. We'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland here on the left end of your dial, or YouTube, or CAN TV, or Google or Spotify webcasts. Okay, or podcasts, they call them. We'll say we'll be right back.
Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back with more Live from the Heartland. I'm Michael James. I'm your host today. And it gives me a lot of pleasure to bring on someone who I got to know through being part of Network 49 up here in the 49th Ward, the one, the only Ed Mullen. And Ed is a kind of a guy who makes things happen on the election front. I've been calling you an election lawyer, Ed. How about telling us what that is, what your duties would be as an election lawyer? What do you do?
Sure. So most of the clients that I have right now are people who are either elected officials or who want to be elected officials. And as you know, there is a very difficult process involved in Chicago to get on the ballot to run for office. And there is an objection process that is a little bit of a blood sport here in Chicago and Cook County to make sure that only people who have complied with all of the requirements are actually on the ballot. And so I'm involved in helping candidates get on the ballot and helping candidates knock their opponents off the ballot if they don't comply with the law.
And that's good that you keep people within the confines of the law, because the laws, well, not all the laws work for the people, but some of them do. One of the things that, I saw you the other day over at Maria Haddon's campaign office, and that has become the Brandon Johnson in the 49th Ward office. And I'm assuming that you are rooting for Brandon Johnson. And I am curious to know your thoughts on how you see the mayoral race shaping up. Many predictions you might have, any problems, momentum, those kind of things. Take it away.
Sure. Well, I think it's a very interesting race in the sense that, if we go back to 2015 or 2019, and we were sitting at this time before the election, I think we had a pretty strong sense of who at that point was going to win the election. And I think at this point, we really don't know. I think it's going to be a much closer race. And one of the other things that's interesting is that we have moved from a lot of people voting on election day and potentially early voting to a lot of people voting by mail. We have no excuse absentee ballots, and we now have a permanent vote by mail ballot list. So if you elect, you can be on the permanent vote by mail ballot list, and you automatically get a vote by mail ballot. And what that means is that if you put it in the mail, it doesn't necessarily arrive to the board to be counted on election day. And so there are a lot of races that were not decided until long after election night. So I think it is possible, if not likely, that in this particular race, we may not know who the next mayor is at the end of the day on election day on April 4th.
Do you have any sense about anyone's popularity or chances of victory or loss increasing or decreasing, whether it be the Ballas or Johnson?
Increasing or decreasing over time. I think, Vallas came in with a larger base, but the question is whether or not he has a lower ceiling because of his comments about being a Republican, his comments that he fundamentally opposes abortion, his support for Awake Illinois, which is a conservative group that's been, trying to ban books and protest drag shows and things like that. And so there's a lot of associations that Paul Vallas has that I think give him a fairly low ceiling, whereas Brandon, I think, was less well known coming out of the original election, and I think he has more room to grow. So the question is going to be who gets their voters out in the next 2 weeks. And just looking at the race from my vantage point, it seems like Brandon has a little bit more momentum. The question is whether it's going to be enough to put him over the finish line on election night.
Yeah, my sense a little bit is that there is more momentum for Brandon than there had been. We had 9 candidates in the race for mayor. 7 of them were African American. So Brandon, I think I heard from somebody, might have even been you, that Brandon didn't get more than 40% in any one ward, didn't win any black wards. But he seems to, like I know among a lot of people who were Harold Washington supporters way back, um, there seemed to be everyone was still waking up from like a Rip Van Winkle kind of a vibe and emerging and getting all of a sudden getting involved. So I think on that front it looks good. Do you think endorsements matter? And what is your take on people who have endorsed either side? I'm particularly interested in you had various people coming out for Vallis, including I heard Bobby Rush. But at the same time, you have plenty of black ministers who are coming out for Brandon. So any take on any of that?
Yeah, I think if you look at the number of endorsements, that Brandon's endorsements are significantly, longer list than the endorsements for Vallis. But to me, there are three things that you can get from an endorsement. You can get the aura of the endorsee, and I think someone like a Jesse White is a good endorsement for Paul Vallis because it gives him an aura of acceptability to the black community and cover to support the white guy over the black guy in the mayoral election. And then you got money. So the operating engineers are giving money. I think they gave $500,000 today or yesterday to Vallis, and CTU and SEIU were giving millions of dollars to Brandon's campaign. And so if you've got an endorsement that comes with money, that gives you power. But then there's also endorsements that come with organization. So you've got I know Andre Vasquez here in the 40th Ward, he's been getting his people out and, knocking on doors and phone banking. And he's not the only one. I'm just saying that because,
a lot. Yeah.
he's been very active in doing it, and it's close to me. So I see it. But if you've got an alderman that endorses and then puts the weight of his organization behind getting people out to vote and convincing people to vote for their candidate, then that's a strong endorsement. I think there are a lot of endorsements that are meaningless. Brandon got the endorsement of Ayanna Pressley, the representative from Massachusetts today. That's a nice tweet, but I don't think that's a really helpful endorsement in the long run. So if you've got money, you've got organization, or you've got a significant endorsement from a person like a Jesse White, I think those can push the needle. But I think a lot of endorsements just don't matter. I do think the endorsement of Chewy for Brandon was an important endorsement for him.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, hopefully it matters a whole lot. And the other thing is, you mentioned money. You mentioned the operating engineers. I hadn't known where they had gone, but you have the Uline people, and then the other guy who used to live in Illinois and moved to Florida. I mean, these are some of the really wealthy, big time people who don't live in Chicago, but they are putting a lot of dough into the Vallis campaign. Right.
So the company that Ken Griffin works at, and he moved to Florida, the employees at Citadel or partners or whatever they are, have been giving a very significant amount of money to Paul Vallis, and the investment community has been giving a significant amount of money to him. The business community, so Vallis has been getting a huge amount of support from people that otherwise support Trump, supported Bruce Rauner, very more on the conservative side of the ledger for sure.
Any thoughts on the issue that both candidates are talking a lot about is the police? Brandon Johnson came out with a, defund the police way back. He's kind of walked it back a lot. Vallis, you would think the only issue facing the city is the police. And we did talk earlier in the show about a new report out about police training, which is pretty negative. What's your take on the police issue for both these two candidates?
Well, I think Paul Vallis came into this race he has experience in education and running school districts and running them into the ground, in my experience. But, he doesn't really have public safety experience, but he has constantly been talking about the police and public safety and crime and making people in Chicago safer. And I think the fact that he has been constantly talking about that means that people associate him in a lot of ways with law and order and keeping people safe. But he talks about police, where Brandon talks about public safety. And Brandon's idea of public safety is a lot broader than having police to come and respond to crime and to solve crime, but thinking about how we prevent crime, how we provide educational opportunities, how we provide economic opportunities, how we make sure people are housed, how we make sure that we have the trauma response team that goes to deal with mental health crises, so those don't escalate into violent situations where either police or the citizens can be hurt. So I think Brandon's idea of public safety is much broader than the view set forth by Vallis, which is very much we need more police and we need to lock people up and we need to have a almost militaristic response to the public safety issues here in the city, whereas Brandon, is much broader. But it's a huge, stark difference between them. You've got one of the more liberal of the 9 candidates and the more conservative of the 9 candidates here. The folks who were in the middle of those 9 candidates are not here anymore. You've got a real stark difference between the 2 candidates and a real stark choice between how they view not only public safety, but the role of government in the lives of people in the city of Chicago.
Ed Mullen, I'm going to jump back to endorsements and just ask one thing. Do you think that Mayor Lightfoot will endorse at all? Or going to cool it?
I would be surprised if Mayor Lightfoot endorses. One, I don't know that the candidates still in the race have requested an endorsement. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I just haven't heard anything about that. But my expectation, based on conversations that I've had with people who are friendly with the mayor, is that that's not in the cards. But you never know.
All right.
What I think is more interesting, Michael, is the governor.
What's with him?
JB Pritzker said a couple weeks ago that he was, or maybe not even a full couple weeks ago, that he was going to remain neutral in the race. And then these comments that Paul Vallis made on a radio show where he was subbing for Dan Proft about JB Pritzker's response to the COVID crisis being autocratic, and a lot of sort of negative comments about the way that both Lightfoot and Pritzker handled the response to COVID, caused JB Pritzker to, make a subtle dig at Vallis yesterday. And, he might
endorse.
He might endorse, or he might make some phone calls and move some other people and without a public endorsement, let it be known where he stands.
Well, I hope he does that, because I got to say, I remember when he came to the Heartland way back in our early days, the Heartland Cafe, and I wasn't that friendly to him, but I've liked him as our governor and been pleasantly surprised. Before we go to the aldermanic races, let me ask you, if you were a gambling man, who do you predict will win the mayoral race?
I think it's going to be very close, but if I were a gambling man right now, I'd bet on Brandon.
Yeah, I hope so.
And I think a 51-49 win is more likely than a 53-47 win.
I know that you have been working with some of the aldermanic candidates. We have, I don't know how many, is it 9? And we have a number of aldermanic runoffs around town.
14.
14. And you want to talk a little bit about some of those, and then we'll get to the city council and its makeup going forward.
Sure. So there are 14 runoffs. There are only two, I believe, incumbent aldermen who were forced into a runoff. Jim Gardner up in the 45th Ward was forced into a runoff with Megan Mathias, just missed getting 50% with about 48%, but most of his opponents have banded together and endorsed Megan. And there's a lot of issues about his suitability for being in public office at all that are going to be important in that race. But he started off with 48% of the vote, so that's a tough hill to climb. The other incumbent was Chris Taliaferro, who just lost his race for judge, but he was up over the 50% number up until the last vote by mail ballots were counted, and he just fell below when the write-in candidate was added to the total by just a few votes, and so he has a runoff. Up here on,
let me ask you about him. Is he a progressive, a machine?
He's in the progressive caucus.
Okay.
I don't think he's the most progressive of the progressive caucus, but he's more progressive than the average alderperson in the city. And then on the north side, we've got the 46th ward to replace James Kappelman. You've got Angela Clay versus Kim Walz. The big news in that race is that the independent expenditures in support of Kim Walz in that race have exceeded $100,000. The only race in the city where that has happened so far. And so all of the contribution limits have been eliminated in that race as of yesterday, because mostly the Illinois Realtors Association is in supporting Kim Walz. And there's been a lot of development in the 46th ward, particularly along the lakefront with some of the high rises. And I think there's definitely a gentrification versus affordable housing race there.
Well, let me ask you one more thing, though. That we had Angela Clay on the show 4 years ago when she was running. I worked in Uptown back in the old days with Joint Community Union. Helen Schiller was there. It's always been an area with a lot of poor people, but had some really plusher neighborhoods. And I would assume that the real estate interests are not going for anyone who would be detrimental to their cause, and that would be Angela Clay. But she got hit, I believe, with some stuff about back taxes. Is that a issue, you think?
Cranes did an article about that, and it's behind a paywall, so I wasn't able to read it. So I don't know what the issue is. One thing you learn in going through these races is that every aldermanic candidate is something that you can highlight that's a negative for them. And the problem for Angela is that there's $100,000 behind mail pieces, making that a big issue. So whether it's a big issue or not, the problem is that there's $100,000 and more behind mail pieces that are going out to the neighbors saying that she's got financial issues.
What's the situation with Gardner? He would be, he doesn't seem like a very popular guy. And you do think Megan Mathias has a good shot at that?
Well, I think she has a shot. I mean, the problem is that Gardner eliminated during the redistricting the wards that the precincts that had gone strongly for John Arena, and added precincts to the 45th ward that were more conservative. And so he drew a map for himself that was much more favorable than the previous map. So I think it's a difficult race, but it's a winnable race, given the negatives of Gardner, and given that a lot of his opponents have banded together to support Megan and vote him out.
Ed Mullen, this has been great, and I look forward to having you on maybe after the election. But let me ask you one last question, and that would be, what do you think will be the makeup of the city council and the role of the Progressive Caucus, the size of the Progressive Caucus and its role,
Right.
or
So,
any new mayor?
right. So I think regardless of what turns out, the Progressive Caucus is going to grow. But not to throw your question back at you, I think the more interesting thing that's going on right now is Scott Waguespack and Michelle Harris and Jason Irvin, who Scott used to be the chair of the Progressive Caucus, but is not been an active participant in that since he became the finance chair 4 years ago. But they have banded together to try to create a new set of rules for the city council for the next cycle, and also to change the way that the committees are selected so that the council people actually vote for who their chairs and vice chairs are, instead of those being selected by the mayor. And I think they're trying to get a lot of that done before the election, because it's going to be harder once you've got a mayor-elect to get some of those changes made, because that mayor-elect is going to fight some of those changes. So I think the Progressive Caucus is going to be larger and more powerful. I don't think it's going to be 26, which is what you would need for a majority. But I do think that the next council is going to be much more independent from the mayor than they have been in our lifetimes.
Well, that's probably a real good thing. And Ed Mullen, you always enlighten me, and I appreciate you coming on the show. And I'll see you in the neighborhood for sure.
All right. Take care. Thanks, Michael.
Very much. And everybody out there listening, we're going to close out the show with a little bit of information. Coming up on this show, I think it's on April 8th, we have John Melrod. He is the author of Fighting Times, Organizing on the Front Lines of the Class War. I want to make sure that we get some thank yous in here to our board, which would be Katie Hogan, Lynn Orman, Tom Clark. And I certainly want to thank our engineer, Hal James. And we have a lot of work to do out there. There's a lot of election stuff going on, not only in Chicago, but you could go up to Wisconsin and help get a Democrat elected to the Supreme Court. They had, looks like their numbers are good, but you never know. And that would change the shape of a lot of Wisconsin politics. And it would have ramifications for the whole country and probably for the world. So I always want to say, do what Athletes United for Peace do, and that would be do sports, not war. And I want to say do good in the world, because the world needs all the good that you do, that I do, that we do together. And we'll be back next week with more Live from the Heartland, whether you get it on air, whether you get it streamed, whether you get it on youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos, where you get it on podcast, that'd be Google or Spotify, or you go to Thursday nights on CAN TV. So with all that said, we will see you next week. Do good. Hasta luego. Buenos suerte. Over and out.
Are you doing the best you can? Over the mountain, under the big blue sky, you got a dream awaiting. I can see it in your eye. It may not come easy, but you know you've got a friend. I'll be by your side the entire ride. Just let me hear you say amen. Are you doing? Are you doing the best you can? Tell me, are you doing? Are you doing the best you can? Tout donne, est-ce que tu donnes le meilleur de toi-même parce que tu l'aimes? Tu donnes, est-ce que tu donnes le meilleur de toi-même si tu l'aimes? Tu donnes, est-ce que tu donnes le meilleur de toi-même quand tu l'aimes? Are you doing the best you can? Tell me, are you doing?